Yes, we are here for our winter quarterly town hall here for Housing California. This is our third town hall in this new wave of doing things, and trying to connect folks to the work that's happening in the state capitol, and some of the work that's being done here in Sacramento and statewide. And today we are going to be focused on the budget, and we have a whole group of great speakers here, both focusing on the state and the federal budget. And so we have a great group of folks. Maybe we'll go to the next slide here. And I am Chris Martin. I am our policy director here at Housing California. As I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the governor's budget, where things sit as it relates to his proposal, the legislature's work on the budget this year, and then we're going to step back and look at the budget writ large. Think about some of our advocacy work around the budget, and then also be talking about the federal budget and everything that is happening over there and some opportunities that are arising with the federal landscape. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we got a great group of folks from the Senate and the Assembly budget committees have joined us here to talk about where things are in the budget process. Chris from the Budget Center. We got 3 different folks from our budget coalition that we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as Kim from the National Low Income Housing Coalition to talk about how things are moving on the federal side of things. So we do have a jam-packed agenda today. We're going to try and achieve everything in the next hour and a half, but we do have breaks for questions and answers, and hoping everybody can place their questions in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A. It's easier to track them there, and we will be sure to capture them and try and get them along to the panelists as we go, as well as some time for questions at the end. But with that, I will kick us off to our first set of speakers, Tim and Genevieve, to talk about the budget. Over to you two.
Thanks, Chris. Genevieve and I are going to tag team this morning. First of all, our appreciation to all of you for being here and for having us here to chat with you today. Our plan is to start out with some context here by beginning with a quick review of what would be the ordinary budget timeline and process. Many of you already know this and may be familiar with it, some may not, but either way, we felt like it was important to start with that in order to sort of set the stage for the next point, which is how we anticipate that this year is likely to be a little bit different in terms of the timelines. And then with that stage set, we'll delve into a little bit into the summary and key takeaways from the governor's January proposed budget. Both Genevieve's going to handle the housing realm, and then I'll go on and talk about points more specifically focused on homelessness interventions. Once we've gone over that, we're going to try to give you a sense of where we think things stand as we begin legislative review of the governor's budget. Genevieve will handle the assembly, and I'll give you the Senate perspective. And then finally, we're going to try to close it out with some thoughts on how all of this impacts how we think advocates might approach this particular budget season. So with that as an overview of what we're planning to hit, if you can get us to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Genevieve to take over for the next bit.
So good morning, Genevieve Morelos with Assembly Budget Committee. And so just wanted to start off with the basics here, the annual state budget process and how it works. These key dates, they stay the same. They don't move. They're always there. So you have in November, we get the Department of Finance gets estimates in order to build the budget for the next year. In January, the governor releases his budgets based on those November estimates. In May, we get better numbers based on tax revenues. So then the governor comes out with his new proposals for the May revision. And by June 15th, we pass a budget, and then there's an end of session where we clean everything up. It sounds very basic, sounds very, very simplified, but there's always nuances. And already in this year's budget, we have the start of it with the November estimates having some issues that Tim will talk about a little bit later. So next slide, please. So again, this is how like the navigating the budget process goes. The blue is the governor's timeline, the orange is the legislative timeline, and the green is basically where there's time for public input. We anticipate, you know, those same public input points being there. It's just a matter of, you know, what you're looking at and when we get revised numbers. So we know that the governor's January budget came out, and, you know, it started out the estimates from the November estimates were off. We have that, we can see that in two different places. One, how the LAO addressed the deficit and how the governor addressed the deficit. They were both kind of different, and that's okay because they use different numbers to estimate what the budget deficit would be like, but they're off, they're different. They're not as close as they usually are in normal years. So I think that's one of the big things that we started out with this year. And then the process as it moves forward is, you know, January is the start. We'll start here. The legislature will start looking at the budget, and we'll move through the next month having hearings and waiting for more information, and especially waiting for the May revision is where the big point of the budget we'll have a better idea of what those numbers look like. And I think from now to May is a long time, and there's lots of work to be done during this time. And as always, with all the hearings, you have time for public input and, you know, talking about what's important to you, what programs you want to see continued, and there'll be many strategies for how advocates work through that public process as well. So getting to the next slide.
All right, so all of the sort of deadlines and timeline that Genevieve just described is the same as it is in an ordinary year, except as Genevieve sort of foreshadowed, this year is likely to be a little bit different in the following sense. We have the delayed tax information because of the delay in the IRS's tax filing deadline last year. So our revenue numbers came in later than we would ordinarily have them. And as you all know, that resulted in significant deficits, but also a situation in which we aren't 100% sure what the revenue picture is going to look like going forward. That's always true, but it is particularly true this year because of the delays. To further complicate matters, as many of you have been, if you happen to track the stock market, are aware, they've been hitting record highs of late. The California's tax revenues are highly correlated with the performance of the stock market in many circumstances. So you might think, okay, well, maybe we're on our way out of this budget problem. Revenues should shoot up if the stock market is shooting up. But as it turns out, thus far at least, according to the LAO's analysis and early numbers, we're not necessarily seeing tax receipts for California responding to the performance of the stock market yet. That could change. So bottom line, the revenue picture remains difficult to predict. We also have legislative leadership changes taking place. The Assembly already made its change last summer, I guess. Now it's been a number of months, but some of the changes in terms of committee leadership are still just underway, and people are sort of getting their feet underneath them. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And on the Senate side, of course, Senator Mike McGuire will take over as the pro tem on February 5th from Senator Atkins. And associated with that is likely to be some committee changes in committee leadership changes in the Senate as well. With all this in mind, we have also received from the administration an indication that we should not expect, as we ordinarily would, to receive April and May finance letters that would give us sort of further proposals and further refinements on the governor's January budget. In other words, that we will get almost all of the revised proposal together with the May revision that Genevieve referred to earlier. As I was thinking about this earlier this morning, I also realized, of course, the additional, particularly in the housing space, the additional piece of information that's going to come in over the course of the spring is whether Proposition 1 passes. It's on the March ballot, as I'm sure you're all aware. So with all of that in mind, and with the one caveat that it is possible that we will that the legislature will undertake early action in order to deal with some of the budget issues earlier than June. The key takeaways here are, and now we're ready for that next slide, is that we're going to be dealing with a hyper-complex timeline this year, almost for sure. As Genevieve alluded to, May and June are always the sort of crunch time for the budget cycle. But this year in particular, because of all the issues I just mentioned, it is likely to it'll be that, but on steroids is what we anticipate and what we think everybody should be preparing themselves for. And so the governor's January budget proposal is always just a starting point, but this year perhaps even more than ever. So we're, as Genevieve said, we're not exactly in a holding pattern here. We will be doing our legislative review. Everybody should be doing their advocacy work, but in a sense, there's a lot that is still in flux and will be until later in the spring. So now we turn to the specifics of the governor's budget proposal for the housing and homelessness realm, sort of bearing all this hopefully in mind. So I'll turn it back to Genevieve for the specifics on the governor's housing proposals.
Just one other thing to add to what Tim said right there. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting this year is that the content that we're going to get is going to be in January and it's going to be in May. And that's different than the content that we get on a regular year where you get stuff slowly rolling in, but the governor said no April, May. So it's going to feel weird. It's going to be awkward. I think that's the best way to put it. Is going to be an awkward little moment of time where I think people are going to be really looking for more content and there isn't going to be any. So moving into the governor's budget for housing, we saw, I think a lot of us were a little bit surprised, maybe not too surprised, but the big cuts that we saw 1.2 billion in budget solutions in the housing world, which included a number of cuts to programs that we had funded in previous years and also in the current year. So the governor made cuts to the regional early action planning grants, the REAP grants, which reverted 300 million of the 600 million. He cut in the additional dollars that we put in for the multifamily housing program. He cut the delays that he had put in last year in the budget for the foreclosure intervention housing preservation program. So it has some dollars, but the out years, it doesn't have any. For the infill infrastructure grant program, not the, this is just the straight IIG program. He reverted 200 million of the 25 million for 23-24. And then next slide, please. Then he also reverted money that we had put in for Cal Home, additional money for the Veterans Housing and Homeless Program, funding for housing navigators, which go to foster youth. And I think, this is all to say like what happens in the big housing picture. And basically for this current year, but for the proposed budget year 24-25, there's no additional money for the low-income housing tax credit. There's no additional general fund investments for housing. There's no bond dollars because pretty much they are spent. And so the housing outlook, what we're seeing out there is that it doesn't look great. I think we're back at a starting point of maybe 2012 where there was no investments running through housing. So we always somewhat have like maybe a underlying bond for housing. I guess the best way to look at the housing dollars is you have a few components. You have the federal dollars, you have the bond dollars that are going. I think we had bonds in 2000, 2006, and then 2018. And so you have those dollars kind of moving through the cycle. You have a little bit of layer of the tax credits, about 100. I think this year the base tax credit's about 120 million on there. And then you had general fund investments, and the general fund investments were a little bit different than the bond investments. The bond investments were like stapled staple programs like the multifamily housing program. A lot of the general fund investments that we put in with the surplus over the last few years have gone to new programs and also have gone to programs that we know work. Like we added money into the multifamily housing program. We added money in for infrastructure to get sites ready. So all of these things were moving the housing along. And then we get to 24, 25, and we have none of those things moving forward. We don't have general fund, we don't have bond, we have some federal, we have a little bit of DGRF for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, but that's still different than the basic core flagship program of multifamily housing program. So it's the housing, it's concerning. We're all really concerned about what the housing outlook looks like right now, as far as making sure that we're getting projects moving and there's a pipeline. So that's what we have here in January for the governor's budget. I would just like to emphasize that these are the governor's budgets and his proposed budget, and it's always a starting point for conversations.
All right, I'll pick it up from there. We obviously realize that housing and homeless are intricately connected, of course, but just for purposes of organization, I will take the sort of items that are specifically addressing state's homelessness crisis. And here, overall, the governor's office described their January budget proposal as maintaining the existing state of homelessness funding. That's mostly true, but there are some important, really important nuances within that. So the big budget story in the homelessness realm is in relation for this year, as it has been past couple of years, been in relation in particular to the Homeless Housing Assistance Prevention Program, HAP. So on the, I suppose we could say the positive side of the ledger, at least from the point of view of the funding for the program, the governor's budget maintains the total of $1.1 billion in general fund for HAP round 5. That's spread across 2023 and 24 and the upcoming year, 24-25, with the following caveats or nuances. The governor's budget does propose a delay of $260 million in what was previously the bonus funding for HAPS round in 3 and 4, and last year got converted into something where it can just supplemental funding. Where does the $260 million come from? It's that bonus funding. But part of it was set aside in last year's budget to be allocated in 23-24, and the governor's budget now proposes to push that back an additional year. Or I may have said the year wrong. I believe it's set to be allocated in 24-25, and the governor's budget delays it for an additional year, proposes to delay it an additional year. From the governor's, the administration's point of view, conversation with them, that's the practical effect of that they feel is not dramatic in the sense that there was already going to be some, there's the process of HAP round 5 of the regional planning, then coordination of administration of the grants. The money was not going to get out before sort of the 25-26 timeframe in any event. In going over the timeline, I think that is probably not the full picture, that there will be some delay at least of several months. I'd certainly be curious to hear from anybody who has sort of thoughts on exactly how that delay might impact services. But from the administration's point of view, at least, this is not intended to impact services. It's just reflects the delay that would already take place for these funds. The second nuance is that the governor's proposal would take savings from $100 million in administrative savings that the administration has reaped from its operation of the HAP program. Their pitch here again is that this doesn't impact services, and that's fair in the sense that the administration should be applauded for sort of efficient and economical operation of the program, but there is some argument there that the money should, rather than being reaped as savings, should go back into HAP services. The other, but buried the lead a little bit, and forgive me for doing so, which is that the sort of big story here is that whereas the legislature expressed an intent in last year's budget to fund a HAP round 6, the governor's budget does not propose a HAP round 6. They do state that they are open to a conversation about additional funding for homelessness, but I think it's important to note that in the budget summary that comes together with the governor's January budget proposal, sometimes known as the A pages, the proposal doesn't mention a specific program, so it doesn't mention HAP specifically, nor does it necessarily mention an amount. So I think the bottom line is that it is important for everybody to view this as a situation in which additional HAP round 6 is not necessarily a given, and this is definitely will be a source of conversation. It's also key to note that the governor's office said that that conversation is in part contingent from their point of view on recipients of HAP funding in the past making progress on their commitments from earlier HAP rounds. So I think you can expect some further conversation about whether the HAP dollars are being spent as effectively as the administration believes that they could be spent. I think I will leave the HAP round 6 point there and just note quickly that it is important that the governor's budget proposal from January does not include any cuts to the encampment resolution fund, as it's called. I believe that's $400 million in 24-25 remains so. And it does also include delays to a number of health and human services programs. We can get into that a little bit more detail if folks are interested in those specifically. But without further ado, then we turn over, if you're going to get the next slide, to legislative landscape. I think we're probably pushing our time here. Genevieve, you want to start by telling folks about where things stand for the Assembly?
Yes, I'll go pretty quickly. As you guys know, last year we had changes in our leadership, and so we now have a new speaker, Assemblymember Rivas, and we also have a new budget chair, Assemblymember Gabriel. And this is a big change. We haven't had this turnover in a while, so as always, we're getting used to new priorities, new styles, and a new way of looking at the budget. I think that one of the things that the speaker has said is that this will be a caucus approach to budget. And so that's making sure that all the members have a say in how the budget moves forward. And I think that is a different approach of a caucus approach is a different approach that we had. Is probably the same approach that we have, but it's a caucus approach that we're moving forward with. The speaker has also said last week he was at PPIC, and he, for the first time, we really heard him articulate some of his priorities that he has. And he said housing, climate change, public safety, and then affordability. So housing is really emphasized with what we're looking at as priorities for the speaker, as well as the budget chair also has housing and homelessness as one of his top priorities. So I think that's kind of how we're moving through. We're working on priorities. We're working on hearing schedules for the Assembly. All of our hearings should be on the file probably this week. So we'll have like an outline of what we're going to do. There'll be a little bit of changes in the Assembly for the committees. We have an additional subcommittee this year. So they broke out Health and Human Services. So instead of one committee, they are now 2. And then we have an additional committee, sub 7, on oversight, which is going to be tackling bigger issues, probably likely housing, different topics from housing to broadband. I believe that there are some things in the work. Those may not be on the file yet, but I think they're all big topics that the Assembly will be addressing this session. And then I think, it's a new approach. It's new leadership, but as always, it's still the same process. If you guys have questions or concerns, please reach out to staff, to the members' offices, and just come to us and come often. I think we're going to have this period of awkwardness, of silence. So the more that you can talk about what your priorities are to the committee and the committee members, I think that really helps before we hit May, when I think things are going to go on a crazy fast speed.
All right, and I'll just quickly try to give the Senate side of that picture. We also have a leadership change. Ours, as we mentioned earlier, on the Senate side, it has not taken place yet, although the new leader has been chosen. That will be Senator McGuire. He will take over as the pro tem on February 5th. But there have not yet been announcements about whether there will be committee leadership changes. Presumably there will be some. Whether that includes a change in the budget chair or not is not known to me, and I don't believe known to all but a very few people at this point. The current budget chair, as many of you I'm sure know, is Senator Skinner. She may continue on, or Senator McGuire may appoint a different senator to take that role. Similarly, the sub-chair leadership positions may change with that change in pro tem leadership. So there's a lot up in the air in that regard, and that, as we alluded to earlier, is part of what is going to compress back some of these timelines. We will still carry out our hearings on the same, our subcommittee hearings on the same timeline over the next couple of months. But some of the nuances to some of the topics and proposals you can expect to be a little bit different depending on how leadership shapes up. I will, on specific hearings, these also, I don't believe these have been noticed yet, and they're not finalized, but you can pencil these in for the sub 4, which handles housing and homelessness for the Senate. Expect a hearing on March the 14th, the morning of March 14th, regarding homelessness spending and oversight. That will include the HAP proposals. And on April 18th, the housing proposals in the budget were generally including those involving HCD. So those are when I anticipate that the big hearings will take place. Please pencil those in, but look for the formal notice for confirmation. Do we want to do, we were going to do quick reactions from how our committees responded to the governor's proposal. I don't know if we may be short on time for that. They were very initial and very broad. I would say in general, the members didn't like the idea of cuts and are hoping that the revenue situation will improve. That's the short version. Yeah.
Short version for the assembly as well. And I think that everyone was really, and particularly bothered by the cuts to housing.
Yeah. So let's just wrap up then with our considerations of 2024, what this all means for budget advocacy. We will work quickly. Genevieve, you want to hit the first one? I'll take and we'll just split back and forth quickly through these.
Sure, go ahead. I think one of the biggest things is, an approach of defense versus offense. We know that there is a budget shortfall. We're seeing the revenues even come in low for January. So it's, for advocates, you have to think about what programs you want to protect, which, it's a hard one to say, but it's like what programs you have to advocate for, the programs that are there that could possibly go away versus versus advocating for new programs, because I think new programs in a budget deficit will always be really difficult.
And related to that, this sort of sums up what we've been saying all along. That is, we highly recommend that you use this next couple of months to respond quickly to divergent revenue scenarios in late spring, right? Not trying to tell anybody how to do their job as advocates, but I suppose I would say if I was in your shoes, I would be wanting to have a game plan ready for what are we going to do? What do we anticipate happens if revenues get worse? And what's our response going to be? What are our proposals? What do we do if revenues stay the same? If revenues improve, where does that give us opportunities to perhaps look for stuff to add back in or things to protect? But having that game plan in advance, because as we are trying to emphasize throughout this, May and June are going to be hyper compressed even more than usual. I'll add that it's a good idea to keep an eye on out years. The projected deficits are not just for this year, but in the range of $30 billion for the next 3 coming out years. So any money that is left dangling out there sort of unspent, you need to be thinking about as having a proverbial target on its back in the out years. So just something to be thinking about whenever you see sort of delays. You need to also be thinking that's very potentially out there as a potential cut in the out years. And I'll leave the last point to Genevieve.
The last one is just to be realistic in your ask. I think an example of something unrealistic is creating a brand new program that costs billions of dollars. I think that in this budget, it's going to be very difficult. So just trying to make sure that you're advocating for tried and tested programs, because I think those are where, you know, a lot of our if we have money to invest, that's where they'll go, to things that work. So tell us the programs that work and why they work, and give us data. I think that's the best way to be realistic in this budget that we have. And also to do a budget rain dance, because I think we all will be trying to hope that revenues get better. So if everybody does it, maybe they will get better down the line. I think we are prepared. We do have funds in the budget to prepare for this, but I think during my lifetime here in the budget, and I've been here since 2012, I think this is the first year that it's really a deficit that is significant, and I think it'll be a different approach to the budget this year.
Well, thanks to Genevieve and Tim for taking time out of your day to be here with us and share all of your insights and intel on the budget. We do have a couple questions while you're still here. I can try and hit two of them if we have a quick second. The first is, I think folks don't necessarily, I mean, I'm still learning some of these things, but like the terminology. So when the governor talks about reverting funds or pausing funds or, you know, pushing funds out, you know, what that means. And, you know, when they say pause or revert or what have you, kind of like, could you clarify for folks what those terminologies typically mean and what it looks like in the budget?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, revert, would be that they're taking that money back and they're using it for another purpose. The shifts or delays, those are going, they're saying we care about a program, but we're gonna schedule it into the out years. But you know, budgets are done in the budget year, so the out years will be determined in out years. So it's not like it's unless it's built into the baseline, it's not certain, because everything can be changed in an out year. So if they shift it from 24-25 to spend in 25-26, it's not a guarantee that those monies will be there in 25-26. Tim?
Yeah, I think you covered it well. First of all, I sympathize. I'm just joined the budget committee a year ago, and some of the terminology really drives me wild. It also is frequently used interchangeably by advocates, by members, even by the administration. But in general, a reversion is money that was already allocated. So it was in, let's say, last year's budget, 23-24. Right? Everybody, all three parties, the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor had agreed we're going to spend a certain amount of money on this project, let's say $100 million. But when we are now looking at this year's budget, we look at that, we say, oh, you haven't spent that $100 million yet. It's still sitting out there. So we're going to revert it. We're going to take it back out of that budget from 23-24 and now count it as savings. As savings instead. So it's money that was already allocated being taken back, as opposed to a cut, which is where we have money that was proposed for, let's say, the coming year. There have been an agreement previously, hey, we're going to spend $100 million next year on the following project. And now in this year, we're saying, no, we're going to pull that money back. That would be a cut as opposed to a reversion. And then delays, as Genevieve says, it's okay, we had planned to spend the money this year. We had allocated the money for this year, but we need that savings now. So we're not going to spend it this year. We're going to push that out for an additional year. That looks like savings in the present year, but of course it adds to the deficit in the out years. Hopefully between the two of us, we answered the question. Happy to follow up with anybody if people have individual questions on that. I think our email comes up on the next slide.
Thank you, Tim. And we haven't even talked the GAN limit yet. I noticed you all talked about the DSS/HHS funds, and I'm wondering, I noticed somebody's interest in the chat around hearing what those cuts / more so delays are in that funding. So if one of you is willing to share about that.
Sure. I'm just going to run down the list here. There's a shift of 265 million from the Mental Health Services Fund for behavioral health bridge housing. So that's out of the general fund and now being pushed in, funded by it from a different source, from the Mental Health Services Fund. 235 in general fund being delayed to 25-26. Again, that's for behavioral health bridge funding. Behavioral health continuum infrastructure program, there's a delay of 140 million in general fund to 25-26. Let's see, that leaves 380.7 million in the final round of grants in 25-26. But again, all these stuff that gets pushed out as delays is then has a little bit more of a question mark associated with it. Bringing families home program, there's a delay there of 80 million to 25-26. The home safe program delay of 65 million to 25-26, and the HDAP, the housing disability advocacy program, delay of 50 million in general fund to 25-26. Those topics, because they're health and human services, will not be covered in will be covered within the budget sub hearings, at least on the Senate side. And I believe it's sub 3, our health and sub 5 health and human services committee.
Awesome.
I don't know if that's as much. We can go on and consider a little more detail about that, but I think that hopefully gives the quick summary you were looking for.
That's really helpful. I'll just add that a lot of those funding programs were much smaller originally, and then the governor did this whole family homelessness initiative a few years back, which increased funding for a lot of those programs that Tim just mentioned, and now they're looking at reverting those resources. So with that, I think at this point I'll let y'all go on with your day. Appreciate you being here with us. You can see Genevieve and Tim's contact info here. And if you need any help getting a hold of them, feel free to reach out to me. And really do want to appreciate Genevieve and Tim, who are very busy for probably the next 6 months. Appreciate y'all taking the time to talk with us and share your insights on the budget.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to my fellow Chris, the better Chris Hoene.
Hey, thank you. Nice to be with you all today. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of some things that are connected to what Tim and Genevieve just shared, and also help understand how we got here, what's going on with revenues, what the out years might look like, why there's so much fluctuation with the state system, and to give you a sense of what that might mean in terms of revenue options. So I'll go to the next slide. One of the things to understand is that you heard Genevieve say that there are different estimates. The governor came out and said that he thought the budget deficit was $38 billion. The LAO, Legislative Analyst's Office, that works for the legislature, said that they thought it was $68 billion. The LAO has since come out and said if they measured things the way that the governor measures things, that number would be about $58 billion. So I just want to say that they're about $10 billion off. You heard Genevieve reference that. So you've heard a lot of big numbers, but one way or another, there's a shortfall that has to be resolved over several budget years. So that means changes that they can still make to a prior fiscal year in 2022-23, all the way up to the year that they're now planning for next year. One of the things to understand is that the deficit is almost entirely due to declining revenues based on the taxes that Californians paid for the year 2022. And that was a really significantly down year economically. The stock market in particular had a very down year, and that affected the state's revenues in really significant ways that we're now dealing with. And we might have dealt with some of that back in last year's budget cycle if we were all filing our taxes at normal times. But because we were allowed to file our taxes in October and November instead in April of 2023, the state leaders didn't really get a picture of the revenue problem until just this last couple of months. And so that's where the sort of why this seems like big, surprising news all of a sudden. I also want to note that there are out-year projections that both the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office are offering that actually point to ongoing shortfalls over the next several years. I would say that we should be cautious with what those out-year shortfalls look like. The Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office both have very skilled people working for them, but they can most accurately project what spending will look like because they can make estimates of if we did everything we're doing this year, what would that cost for next year? And they can be reasonably close with those estimates. It is really hard for them to project what the state's revenue is going to look like. And the reality is that neither one of their estimates will end up being right in the end because there's just so much that's hard to predict on the revenue side. And so I just want to say, for instance, we had great big surpluses in 2020 and 2021. Neither the administration or the Legislative Analyst's Office were able to project how big those surpluses might be. It's going to be hard for them to project what the size of a deficit might look like. And it might be that it's hard to project whether we're going to actually see revenue growth in the next 4 or 5 months or whether we're going to see revenue decline. So I would just say be cautious about the out-year projections in terms of your advocacy. They are helpful to us, though, on one front, which is they help make the case that there are long-term needs in terms of revenues. And so we can say, look, your own projections say that there's out-year problems, and so we need to do more than just spending cuts and reversions and pullbacks and pauses. We need to actually raise revenues in order to fund essential services and growth in places like affordable housing and homelessness programs in the future. So just to be careful about those out-year projections and use them in sort of certain advocacy ways. Next slide. So the next slide, this is a chart the governor uses that's showing you capital gains revenues as a share of personal income over time. The governor uses this chart in the last couple of years to actually make the case in his budget summary that there's lots of fluctuation or what analysts call volatility in the state's revenues. And a lot of this is coming from capital gains because we have a progressive income tax system, which means we ask people who make more to pay more in terms of how the system is structured. And the people who make a lot more tend to make their income off of stock market gains and dividend gains, which are captured as capital gains in the state budget. And so when the stock market does really well, those folks see lots of gains, shows up in the state's revenues. When the stock market declines like it did in 2022, we end up with big reductions in revenues that are hard to project. And so the little thing to pay attention here in this chart is the difference between that blue line and the black line around the 2022-2023 period. And that black line is the reality of what things have turned out to be. And you see the blue line is higher. That's where this deficit is coming from. And it's primarily from changes in stock market gains. I'll also just note that a lot of the volatility in the state's revenues outside of capital gains also has to do with the fact that we have a lot of very successful large corporations in the state. And those corporations, when the stock market does well, they also do well. And so we see corporation tax revenues come in at higher levels. So the stock market hits both our income tax system and our corporation tax, which are two of the three largest sources of revenue that the state has. So that's how we end up in a period of deficit all of a sudden after not so long ago being in a period of surplus. Next slide. Regardless of that, I do want to note a few things that you've heard some notes about in Tim and Genevieve's presentations. Regardless of whether in surplus or deficit, the state budget should prioritize the well-being and improving lives of Californians. This is true either way. Budget shortfalls tend to threaten essential public services because oftentimes state leaders are only willing to make changes on the expenditure side or to use reserves and not to address revenues. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And state leaders, I want to note, do have tools to address the shortfall, both tools they're proposing to use so far and additional tools that include revenues. And we'll say more about that here in the next few minutes. Thanks. So just a few things to note about how the governor is proposing to solve the shortfall. I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but upper bullets here just talk about all the budget maneuvers. The state's going to use about half of the reserve fund under the governor's proposal, or the different reserve funds. There's some internal borrowing and fund shift. This is all just budget maneuvering that's kind of standard when we go into periods of downturn. For you all, I think the most important part of this is to understand the proposed cuts, delays, deferrals. You could throw in the word reversion. They use all sorts of different language here. I think for all of us to understand is that one way or another, if you're seeing the funding levels in a given fiscal year for the area you care about go down, it's a cut. Doesn't matter whether they're pulling back money they already authorized, pulling back money in the future, pausing money for the future. It's a cut in some way to the fiscal year that's affected. And so there's about $8.5 billion in those cuts in what the governor has proposed. You'll probably see differences in proposals, less proposals in terms of cuts coming from the legislature based on what Tim and Genevieve just said. There's another $7.2 billion in delays and deferrals of those earlier commitments. So this is the reversions and the things that get kicked forward to the future year. I think the piece that you do not hear if you listen to the governor's press conference or you read some of the governor's materials about the budget is that there's sort of a secret $8 billion to be determined set of cuts that affect the part of the state budget that isn't the dedicated minimum that goes to K through 12 schools and community colleges. So we have this minimum funding guarantee for what we call K through 14. And it's in the state constitution under Proposition 98, it's a set of formulas that automatically determine the level of funding for K through 12 and community colleges. Back when we were in surplus or in better years, the governor and the legislature agreed to give an additional $8 billion during that good time to K through 12 schools and community colleges. The governor, in his proposal, basically said he's not going to take that $8 billion back, which means it stays on the books and has to be resolved somehow because it actually will increase the size of the shortfall. And he didn't say how he was going to do that. In the hearings on the budget that have happened so far, folks in the legislature have called this out and gotten the Department of Finance to actually publicly state that, yes, this means another $8 billion will have to be cut from somewhere in the non-schools, non-community colleges part of the budget. So I just want the folks in the Housing and Homelessness community to understand that. There's more that's being proposed for cuts there, particularly for the non-schools part of the budget. And that's all to be determined, and we'll see how the legislature responds. Next slide. Another way to look at this is what the LAO does to outline how the governor's $58 billion budget gap would be resolved. You can see all the different terms here, delays, cost shifts, fund shifts, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide for the thing I think is most important. So we have a version of this slide that basically says what you really need to understand is what's not on the table. There's only a few small changes in the tax code, mostly to conform with things happening at the federal level that produce a little bit of revenue in the governor's proposals. The rest of it is all other solutions. So the tools that state leaders usually use to resolve budget problems are spending cuts, using reserves, other kind of budget fund shifts, or raising revenues. And we just wanted to note that the thing that's not on the table here is any sort of significant raising of revenues, and we think that's a mistake given the size of the shortfall. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the key place where we think there are revenue opportunities in the next couple of slides. So we'll start there. So the place that we would go first is to talk about the corporate tax. Corporations have done very well pre-pandemic in California. They did extremely well during the pandemic, and even despite Federal Reserve interest rate hikes and other changes in stock market conditions, corporations have continued to see growth in their income over time that is significant. And historically, what this chart shows you is what the corporation tax looks like. We've cut that tax significantly over time and through a series of tax breaks, made the overall tax bills of corporations much smaller as a share of their income. So they're paying a lot less today than they were, say, 2 decades ago as a share of what they're earning. So we could do something on the corporate tax side in terms of just raising the rate. That's one option. A second option going to the next slide, would be to actually go after some of the tax breaks and loopholes that are provided to corporations and businesses. The state loses nearly $80 billion a year in tax credits, deductions, and various sorts of tax breaks, the majority of which go to businesses and corporations or go to high wealth individuals. And this chart basically shows you those high wealth or business tax breaks in the gray part of the donut. And then you can see there's a small fraction of these credits that actually go to low-income households through what we call refundable tax credits that provide them cash assistance in various sorts of ways. So we do a lot of giving away of money we could be spending elsewhere to corporations and high wealth individuals. And one thing we could do is temporarily or permanently reduce or eliminate some of those breaks. In past recessions, state leaders have actually temporarily suspended some of these breaks in order to raise some additional revenue. A lot of these breaks don't actually meet intended purposes of creating new businesses. They're just sort of squirreled away as corporate profits. And so there's reasons to actually permanently sunset them, review them, and not be sort of spending money through the tax code. So there's both raising the rate or reducing the tax breaks that would both produce additional revenue. And, you know, the political challenge, I'm sure some of you are thinking about this, that we would face is that a lot of folks will say, well, if we do things that raise taxes on businesses, they'll move or they'll consider leaving the state. And I just want to say that what a disingenuous argument that is. If looking at this next slide, we did an analysis just in the last couple of months that looks at business expenses and the percentage of the business expenses that corporations are actually paying in their taxes, and it's 0.1%. So the notion that somehow raising taxes incrementally in some way on corporations, incrementally on them, but significant for the state in terms of revenues, the notion that that would somehow is so detrimental to their bottom line that they are forced to consider leaving the state is pretty bogus, and is pretty disingenuous. And they've been doing extremely well. We've got analysis coming out in the next month that will show just how well corporations have been doing over the last 20 years relative to how an average person's income in the state has done. And there's a dramatic difference, and the conditions don't change regardless of necessarily how the economy has affected things like the stock market. So there's lots that could potentially be done on the corporate tax front. I also want to note that last year, the Senate, in their budget plan that they came out with late in the budget cycle, called for changing the corporation tax rate and creating more of a graduated structure like we use in the personal income tax system, so that a very small fraction of the most wealthy corporations at the top, the ones that do the very best, would pay a higher corporate tax rate. And then small businesses, everyone else, would pay a lower tax rate. Overall, the state would take in more revenue, and it would be both good for small businesses and more fairly tax the big guys. So that proposal wasn't enacted, but it's still sitting out there as a piece of legislation. You may see folks in the legislature start to push that back into the fore if the revenue picture, as we get closer to May, appears to be worse than people think. So that's just something to keep an eye on. There are some other ways. I just want to talk about the overall revenue options that are available to the state that you'll hear year in, year out. The state's big three revenue sources are the personal income tax, the corporate tax, as I've just said, and our sales and use tax. Most common ways we could raise money through the personal income tax is raising rates at the upper end of household income. This is typically how we've done this in the progressive tax system. As you raise the tax bracket, the overall rate paid for folks who are making, you know, more than $1 million or more than $500,000 or at some even higher threshold. I would note we did this in the past. We did it with Prop 30, which was enacted back in 2012 and then extended in 2016. It's set to expire by 2030, which means actually in terms of out years, the state's potentially going to lose significant revenue. So there is an effort, where you will likely see an effort by advocates who don't want to see that revenue go away, to maintain things where they are now, not necessarily raise rates again at the upper level. But you may see both efforts in future years. I've talked about the corporation tax, so I won't say more there. On the sales and use tax side, what you typically hear people talk about is applying the sales and use tax to a broader range of services. Right now, we tax mainly goods and a few services, but a lot of you could apply a broader range of the sales tax to the service sector, produce some additional revenue. You would need to offset the regressive impacts of that, which is basically to say that more of the impact of that would fall on low-income households. So you'd probably have to offset some of the revenue by increasing tax credits and cash assistance for folks at the low-income and moderate income levels, so they're overall not affected in terms of cost of living. Last thing I'll just say here is that you've probably heard a lot of chatter about wealth-related taxes. There's been attention to efforts to raise a tax on people's wealth so that things that aren't showing up in capital gains, but are the overall stock value of people's holdings or the art they own or overseas holdings, that sort of thing, could be taxed. It's a still relatively untried and untested type of way to tax things at the state level, and the legislation that's been put forward has not yet moved at the state level. The governor's signaled he's very opposed. I'm not sure that there's something you'll see much more about in the current fiscal year, but there is attention to this issue. There are other ways to tax wealth, like through estate taxes and inheritance taxes. The state is prohibited from doing that by a measure that was passed and put in the Constitution in the early 1980s. So if that was something people in the state wanted to explore, there'd have to be a ballot measure to do something like estate and inheritance taxes as well. So I don't think you're going to see any near-term action on wealth-related taxes, but I did want you to know that there are conversations that are out there about those kinds of issues. So that's just kind of the broader picture. Last thing I want to note, if you love stuff on budget and tax policy stuff, we'll be talking more about it at our own conference on April 16th. So you can go to our website and check that out. But thanks for the time, and I'll check out Q&A, try to help out with answers to things there, and happy to take questions if you all have any now.
Thanks, Chris, for all that wealth of knowledge. One question I see in the chat is related to the state low-income housing tax credit, and how that is considered. Is that a tax credit to businesses or benefiting low-income folks? Kind of curious if you could speak to that specific tax credit, since it's really important to our community.
Yeah, and feel free to weigh in here, and folks at Housing California or otherwise. But yeah, the low-income housing tax credit is mostly tax credit that goes to housing developers to encourage them to develop affordable housing. It indirectly, or I should say like directly, but sort of a couple steps down the road, hopefully supports low-income households who then have more housing available because the tax credit's encouraging more development of affordable housing. But it's not a tax credit that directly puts cash in the pockets of people seeking affordable housing. It's more for developers and businesses.
Great, thank you. Not seeing any other. If anyone has a budget-related question for Chris. I'm wondering, maybe Chris, if you could speak to the GAN limit challenges for a minute. I know that's kind of a buzzword / confusing, but would love to clarify that.
Yeah, I'll do my best to see if I can make that, it's a little wonky, make it as understandable as possible. But the state has an appropriations limit, or a spending limit, that was put into the Constitution by voters in 1979. It was sponsored by the same people who brought us Prop 13, the property tax cap, back in 1978. And it was an attempt to try to cap how much the state's spending can grow. So it sort of limits how much spending can grow according to rates of inflation and population growth. It's set at a level that allows the state spending to grow pretty reasonably year in, year out, except for when we get big increases in revenue and then the state spends that revenue, we tend to then threaten going over the cap. So a couple of years ago in 2020 and 2021, when the state had these big surpluses, and then that money needed to be spent because the state has to balance its budget, we threatened going over the GAN limit. The legislature and the governor managed to stay underneath this limit And now, because revenue collections have declined, we're no longer in danger of going over the spending limit. So it's now probably not going to be an issue that threatens the ability of state leaders to spend money for probably another 6, 7, 8 years, unless something else changes dramatically. So that's partly good news. The challenge, however, is that we have another thing in the state constitution passed by voters in 2014 that requires state leaders to put money into a rainy day fund that built up the reserves that state leaders are now able to use to help resolve the shortfall. But the interaction of the spending limit and putting money into the rainy day fund inadvertently results in state leaders not having an incentive to save beyond what's required by the rainy day fund measure from 2014. Basically, any money they would try to save otherwise counts double or triple against the state budget and makes their problem of balancing the budget worse. And so the reason we don't have more money in reserves than we already have, the state leaders are arguing, is this disincentive. And so the governor has a couple of paragraphs in his budget proposal this year that says, even if we're not going to go over the spending limit for a few years, we need to resolve this problem where 2 different constitutional measures that voters passed aren't allowing us to save the money we think we need to save during the good times. So we'll see if anything happens. I think that's a conversation that's going to continue over a couple of years. I don't see them taking immediate action to put something on the ballot this year.
Great, thanks, Chris. Well, with that, we're going to move on to the advocates and our coalition's work around the budget. So starting, I believe, with Andrew at CHPC.
Yeah, hi everyone. Name's Andrew Dawson from the California Housing Partnership. We are a state-created nonprofit that works on increasing the supply of affordable and sustainable homes for low-income people in California. Before I jump into the replications of the budget, the implications of it, I just want to go through a bit of a primer on affordable housing finance. So you see on the left here, you have kind of 0 to 100%. So that's the cost of it to build an affordable housing development. Part of it is private financing, or it could be private financing, and that's, your bank loan. Another huge chunk is a federal subsidy that we get through the low-income housing tax credit. But then we're left with this little gap, and that gap, if you move to the next slide, is made from state and local funding, right? And if the gap is not filled, the housing itself is not built because, we can't build 70% of a development. We have to build it entirely, as well as we're not using those federal resources that are given to us by the federal government. So it's really important to fill that gap, and that's using our state money. So on the next slide, we could see that a lot of these gap financing mechanisms that we have, like the multifamily housing program, the Veterans Housing and Homelessness Prevention Program, among other things, are being reverted or cut. I'm not sure what the right word is anymore, but we could see that we are basically cutting a lot of the funding, and that we have no new general fund funding going into this budget season, which is going to be really hard because we're not going to fill that gap that we see in affordable housing finance. And the next slide, we could see some of the repercussions of that, right? If these cuts go through, we're estimated to reduce production of affordable housing by about 1/3, which is a loss of over 6,000 homes for low-income people living in California. And we'll be leaving federal dollars on the table in the amount of $1.6 billion. And so then in our budget coalition letter, part of what we're asking for is funding the multifamily housing program back to $325 million, the state tax credits, a renewal of $500 million, and the Joe Cerner of farm worker housing and adding $27.5 million to that, among other things, to really fill that gap so that we can continue building affordable housing, which is what we need the most. However, this is only going to last us through the year, but we need an ongoing source of funding, and that's where the bond comes in. So on the next slide, you will see that we have Assembly Bill 1657 by Assemblymember Wicks, which is a $10 billion housing bond. And this is going to be a huge push for us in the next year or so that we can get this on the ballot and we can get it passed. so we can get ongoing funding for a lot of the essential programs to build affordable housing. This includes $7 billion for the multifamily housing program, as well as $1.5 billion for preservation programs, $1 billion for home ownership, and $500 million for tribal and farm worker programs. And we find this as essential in order to have ongoing funding. However, in this year, we still need a lot of funding in order to preserve and produce affordable housing for low-income Californians. And so we ask you to sign on to the letter, as well as help advocate for the bond. And with that, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll stop there and let Sharon go after me.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Rapport with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. CSH is a national nonprofit and community development financial institution that advances housing and services to allow marginalized populations to thrive. We've historically focused on homeless populations, and I'm going to be talking about the impacts of the homeless proposed budget outlook. So if you go to the next slide, please. Our local homeless response systems have been housing and providing services to more people than ever before. But at the same time, we're seeing more people fall into homelessness than ever before. As one example, in 2022, HUD reported over 135,000 Californians who were newly homeless receiving shelter and housing and services support. Many more were probably homeless and did not receive anything, but this gives you an estimate or idea of how many people are falling into homelessness. And this is what's accounting for our increases in homelessness over the last few years. So certainly housing programs, cuts to housing programs that make housing affordable will have down the road huge impacts on the number of people falling into homelessness, and certainly will increase our homeless population in the future. And especially for those programs that are really housing people with the lowest incomes. In the meantime, the governor's proposal around the 24-25 budget around homelessness will also have more immediate effect. There has really been virtually no funding that's ongoing for homeless programs. And for the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program, or HAP, that program, despite lack of ongoing funding, every year it has received one-time funding. And the last few years, since I think 2019, the last few years, it has received $1 billion a year in funding. And so basically zero funding for round 6 for HAP will result in a lot of local programs being unable to serve new people who they're currently not serving. So that will have a big impact on how many people remain homeless for longer. Similarly, delays in funding for Department of Social Services programs will result in people who are currently getting housing subsidies or services to lose those subsidies or services, because there is a delay. Basically means there's not going to be funding going to counties for those programs this next year if the governor's proposal gets implemented. That translates into potentially cuts in housing and services for child welfare involved families, for the case of the Bringing Families Home program, for people with disabilities in the Housing and Disability Advocacy program, and for older adults who are receiving adult protective services under the Home Safe program. Next slide, please. So given that thousands of Californians will die over the next year and in homelessness, and thousands of Californians die each year experiencing homelessness, we are hoping that the governor and state legislators will begin discussions around an ongoing revenue source to pay for housing and services that are at the scale to meet the scale of the need. And that way we will finally be able to begin reducing homelessness. Without ongoing funding at scale, we won't really see reductions in homelessness. But even for programs that have been funded in 2023 and in recent years, we really need to at least be level funding those programs in order to prevent more people from remaining homeless or falling into homelessness. So in the meantime, we're asking for at least level funding for the HAP program. We're also asking for a small investment of $25 million to prevent older adults and people with disabilities, which are the fastest growing homeless populations, from becoming homeless. And we're hoping for $50 to $100 million in landlord incentives because we do see federal voucher programs that are currently providing housing subsidies to households who are at risk of or who are experiencing homelessness. Those households often cannot find landlords to take the vouchers. So these landlord incentives are a proven way to get landlords to be motivated to take vouchers, federal vouchers that households have. Thank you very much. And I'll now turn it over to Francisco Duenas with Housing Now.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Housing California, for bringing us together. My name is Francisco Duenas, and I'm the Executive Director of Housing Now. We are a statewide housing justice advocacy coalition. We're a Big Ten coalition with coalition partners throughout the state. Some of our coalition partners do focus on housing or perhaps on even a specific area of housing justice. And then some of our coalition partners are completely new to housing, or they see the intersection with housing and are looking for a way to advocate. So they might be health organizations, or they might be educational justice organizations, or criminal justice organizations. All of us know that work on housing that, that housing is completely intersectional and impacts all of these other parts of our lives and parts of our communities. And so just wanted to highlight in the opportunities to do advocacy here. There were some questions in the chat about how do we activate, and we definitely have a call to action as part of this town hall, and just wanted to reiterate the importance to stabilize vulnerable households. Sharon touched base upon this a little bit. Genevieve also mentioned the need to lift up how the solutions we're calling for are proven, in particular those that lower our rent burden for our communities. That will also help increase housing stability, right? And we know that those things prevent homelessness for our communities. In particular, there are a few subsections in our communities that are more impacted than others. And that's why we have programs that are targeting them. Sharon mentioned a few of them: older adults, people with disability, renters of color. We know in general across low-income renter households, 79% pay more than half of their income on rent. So that really goes to the point about that's not stable, sustainable, obviously. And so that's why we need these investments. Besides the ones that Sharon mentioned that you see on my slide here, I would also add the final one there, which is funding to provide legal assistance for renters when they are experiencing evictions. The statistics are nationally that it's something like only 3% of tenants have have an attorney when they go to eviction court, compared to 90 plus for landlords. So there's a great access to justice disparity there. And we know that that'll also help stabilize folks, give them perhaps some more time to figure out where they go next, or just prevent an unjust eviction. And so we are asking for 15 to 37 million for that homelessness prevention fund legal assistance. I think that covers it for my end. I'll turn it back to Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Francisco, Sharon, and Andrew. and our broader coalition, which is a very large coalition of multi-sector folks working on housing stability, homelessness, housing affordability writ large. And so you can see in the chat our letter that we've been working on and are collecting signatories on through tomorrow. So would love for you all to join on in support of that budget letter, which also includes mention of the bond, and there is a bond link as well. So hopefully y'all can support those efforts. And with that, we're going to turn our attention to the federal side of things, and really excited to have Kim Johnson here from the National Low Income Housing Coalition to give us the updates from DC. Over to you, Kim.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Chris, and hello, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's my pleasure to be here with you all today. My internet connection has been a little bit wonky today, so if I start cutting out, my apologies, but try your best to flag me. We'll see how it goes. But if I could get the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So I'm here today to talk about the federal outlook for the, unfortunately, still talking about the FY24 budget and the FY25 budget. First, to flag a couple things that we're going to be looking out for early in this year. Final FY24 spending bill for HUD, fingers crossed, and potentially a tax package. So we're going to be discussing those two things first. If I could get the next slide. Thank you. So, as I'm sure folks are very well aware, Congress passed yet another two-tiered continuing resolution to maintain federal funding for programs. This new continuing resolution sets an expiration date for March 1st for 4 of the 12 annual spending bills, and transportation, housing, and urban development, as well as agriculture for our rural development friends, are both included in that March 1st deadline. The other 8 bills all expire on March 8th. But we're going to just be concentrating on those March 1st deadlines. And most recently, this weekend, it was announced that appropriations leaders in Congress reached an agreement on top-line spending allocations, or 302B levels, for each of those 12 appropriations bills. Unfortunately, we are still waiting to hear what those top-line agreements are. So we will be sure to alert our networks as soon as we know more. Next slide, please. Thank you. So by that March 1st deadline for the continuing resolution, the House and Senate will still need to reconcile the differences between the House and Senate draft bills, which we'll talk about in just a second. And they'll need to draft and pass a final FY24 agreement, sending it to President Biden's desk. Next slide, please. So right now, what we're looking at is a pretty significant difference between the House and Senate draft bills. I will pause here for just a second to do a brief recap about where we were and why, despite this, despite what I'm about to tell you, this is still good news and a testament to the power of our advocacy. As a reminder, back in June, under the auspices of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was the debt ceiling agreement, we were staring down the barrel of up to 30% cuts to HUD programs, which of course would have been disastrous. But in both the House and Senate draft bills, we ended up actually seeing funding increases to HUD. In the House bill, we saw $68.2 billion allocated to HUD, which is about a 10% increase from FY23. That House bill, though, does propose some pretty deep cuts to, or the elimination of, some programs, including housing opportunity for persons with AIDS, and a significant cut to the Home Investment Partnership Program. In the Senate bill, we saw overall funding for HUD provided at $70.06 billion, which is about a 13% increase. There were a few funding cuts in that Senate bill, although not as steep, obviously, as the House one. But the important takeaway from both is that at current levels, neither bill is expected to fully provide sufficient funding for housing choice voucher renewals. If I could get the next slide, thank you. So the proposed funding levels in both bills currently comes up short. In the House, the proposed funding level would lead to about 112,000 vouchers lost upon turnover. And in the Senate, it would be about 80,000 vouchers lost upon turnover. Now, to be clear, this is not assistance that would be snatched away from households that are currently using it. These would be vouchers that are lost when a household no longer needs their voucher, and rather than that voucher being reissued to help another household, it would just expire. So it would represent a tremendous step backwards, and a lot of the advancement we've done in securing additional vouchers and expanding the availability of vouchers to people with the lowest incomes. And like, all the previous speakers were talking about too, those vouchers are such a vital piece of ensuring housing stability for people with the lowest incomes. So this would be a really significant step backwards. Next slide, please. Oh, and I should add too, our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities also did an analysis looking at state by state voucher funding levels. I'll pop that in the chat just to go out with our other resources at the end of the call. But according to their analysis, the state of California under the House bill would lose about 15,100 vouchers, and under the Senate, it would be about 10,700. So looking out for FY24, we are still urging our members of Congress to fully fund housing and homelessness programs at the highest level possible in this upcoming FY24 bill, and to support our top priorities, including full funding to renew all existing housing choice voucher contracts, full funding for public housing operations and repairs, the Senate's proposed level of funding for homeless assistance grants, protecting the $20 million in funding for legal assistance to prevent evictions, which is the Eviction Prevention Grant Program, which is fully defunded in the House, and the House's proposed funding for Native housing. I have a link there too, where folks can take action with NLIHC. And next slide, please. And so just to touch on the tax package as well, because I know that there are some provisions that this group would find interesting. There was a final deal struck on a bipartisan tax proposal. That deal expands the child tax credit and some corporate tax breaks, and includes some provisions related to the low-income housing tax credit. That includes restoration of a temporary 12.5% increase to the low-income housing tax credit that had previously expired in 2021. And it supports the increased use of private activity bonds to finance affordable housing. NLHC, however, was pushing for some reforms to the low-income housing tax credit that would make it better targeted to serve people with the lowest incomes and people experiencing homelessness, and to serve rural and Native communities. So we were disappointed to see that those reforms were not included in the tax package. You can check out our CEO's statement on the bill if you would like. Next slide, please. So looking ahead to the new year, the new fiscal year begins on October 1st, 2024. So we are going to be right back in this appropriation cycle again. Congress is still going to be operating under the caps imposed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which holds that spending for domestic programs can only increase by 1% in FY25. So that is going to be another sticky situation with ensuring all of our funding priorities are recognized and housing vouchers are fully funded. Members of Congress are also out of town for the entire month of October for campaigning for those November elections. And of course, for lack of a better word, we have the lame duck session after the elections, where historically, famously, nothing gets done. So we are, I don't want to say up against it, but I do wish I had a bit of a rosier outlook for the federal update to present. But we certainly have our work cut out ahead of us, and we're very grateful to have partners like Housing California, helping us out and working with us on that. So I'll wrap it up now and pass it back over to Chris. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate you running us through all that. Some days I do miss working in the federal side of things. Some days it's a headache. So I appreciate all the work that the coalition does. So there is a question about the HCV renewal and about the additional 900 million. I think it was on a slide a few slides back.
Oh yeah, I think that would be the Center on Budget's infographic might be what you're referring to. But basically what the Center on Budget is saying related to housing choice voucher funding, in order to get full renewals, what we're really looking for is the president's proposed level of funding, which I don't remember off the top of my head. But yes, basically, I think it's the $900 million more than what is currently allocated.
Thank you. And we will, I noticed some comments about the budget letters. We will throw those in the chat again and send those out when we follow up. Yeah, I think we're in good shape. I don't see any other questions. Last call for a question. Otherwise, there's a question about the status of the tax package. I'm wondering, also kind of wondering where the 50% threshold reduction sits as well.
Ooh, the status of the tax package. It is apparently much messier than you would have anticipated, given that it is a bipartisan agreement. In the House, they're hoping to bring up the bill for a vote as soon as tomorrow, potentially this week. Whether or not Speaker Johnson actually brings it forward is a different question. They're trying to move the bill under suspension, which means it will need a 2/3 vote in the House. So 290 people need to say yes to a bill, and getting a 2/3 vote in the House is very, very difficult for reasons that I'm sure I do not need to explain. So what they're hoping for is a very strong showing of bipartisan support in the House. They pass the bill under suspension, which in turn puts pressure on the Senate to pass the bill as it is. What seems to be happening is that once again things are really gummed up. GOP hardliners want to see further discussions around the tax bill and the corporate provisions. Some Democrats in the Senate want to see additional reforms to the low-income housing tax credit, some of the reforms that we've been pushing for allegedly. But it also kind of seems like a messy situation to try to blow up the bill or not see it pass. Basically, it's a mess. Whether or not it actually is enacted really does remain to be seen. Yeah, so unfortunately not better news to report on that either. Yeah.
There is one last question about the federal housing credit expansion opportunities, whether that is being seen in the tax package, or the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act of 24, any opportunities on the housing credit expansion?
Yeah, so the expansions that are in there, I believe, are the ones that are kind of like baked in and that are going to be in there. So that's the 12.5% increase and the private activity bond stuff. So right now, I don't think there's a lot of room to see any other pieces added to that bill, but we are still going to keep pushing for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which does include a lot of those important reforms and expansions to LIHTC.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think with that, we will wrap. Appreciate Kim and everyone who's joined us today to speak, and we will follow up with everyone with the information that was shared today, as well as a recording from this. And our next town hall will be in a few months. I don't know that we have a date yet, but we will announce that shortly. And with that, everyone have a good rest of your 2 days of January, and we'll see you in the next town hall in a few months. Thanks again, panelists.